well, let's read a passage which has been raised for me more than once in the last week by those who are a bit puzzled by it, and it has relevance for the topic we've got for tonight. 2 Samuel chapter 6. Then David mobilized 30,000 special troops and led them to Baal Judah to bring home the ark of the Lord of heaven enthroned above the cherubim. The ark was placed upon a new cart and taken from the hillside home of Abinadab. It was driven by Abinadab's sons, Uzzah and Ahio. Ahio was walking in front and was followed by David and the other leaders of Israel, who were joyously waving branches of juniper trees and playing every sort of musical instrument before the Lord: lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. But when they arrived at the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah put out his hand to steady the ark. Then the anger of the Lord fled out against Uzzah, and he killed him for doing this. So he died there beside the ark. David was angry at what the Lord had done, and named the spot the place of wrath upon Uzzah, which it is still called to this day. David was now afraid of the Lord and asked, "How can I ever bring the ark home?" So he decided against taking it to the city of David, but carried it instead to the home of Obed-Edom, who had come from Gath. It remained there for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. When David heard this, he brought the ark to the city of David with a great celebration. After the men who were carrying it had gone 6 paces, they stopped and waited so that he could sacrifice an ox and a fat lamb. And David danced before the Lord with all his might and was wearing priest clothing, or literally a linen ephod. So Israel brought home the ark of the Lord with much shouting and blowing of trumpets. But as the procession came into the city, Michal, Saul's daughter, watched from a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she was filled with contempt for him. The ark was placed inside the tent which David had prepared for it, and he sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. Then he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of heaven, and gave a present to everyone, men and women alike, of a loaf of bread, some wine, and a cake of raisins. And when it was all over and everyone had gone home, David returned to bless his family. But Michal came out to meet him and exclaimed in disgust, "How glorious the king of Israel looked today! He exposed himself to the girls along the street like a common pervert." David retorted, "I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and his family, and who appointed me as leader of Israel, the people of the Lord. So I am willing to act like a fool in order to show my joy in the Lord. Yes, and I am willing to look even more foolish than this. But I will be respected by the girls of whom you spoke." So Michal was childless throughout her life. Dancing in the Bible, what you in the South call dancing. But I take the liberty of sticking to my northern A for the purposes of the subject. Just a word or two generally about dancing to introduce the subject. It's almost as old as man. As far back as we go, we find that not only learn to walk, but they learn to dance. They used to use dance at particular crises in their life, births and marriages. They didn't usually dance at death, but they certainly did for births and marriages. It was very much associated with fighting and war and hunting, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of African dances, which are war dances, hunting dances, and so on, in which they reenact some of these crises. But from the very first, dancing has also been used in religion to express worship. I'm speaking now of pagan religions, not speaking now of biblical. And one of the features of dancing has been that it has tended to be a communal activity rather than an individual one. There's been far more dancing together than dancing separately. Some people may dance purely by themselves as an individual, but it's not usual. From the very beginning, it's been a way of people doing something in a corporate way acting together as a family or a tribe or a community or a village or what have you. Furthermore, it's been very much associated with the emotional side of life, a way of expressing one's feelings, which are not always easy to express in word alone. You know, sometimes our feelings are so deep that we just can't put them into words. And it has been found that dancing has been an expression of the emotional life that is easier in some ways than expressing verbally what you feel. But the key thing I want to say about dancing is this. It has a two-way effect. It's not just one way, it's a two-way activity. First of all, it is the outward expression of what is felt inwardly, so that the first way is expressing something inside that comes out in dancing. And I'm quite sure that every one of you listening to me now has at some stage in your life danced for joy. You've had some good news or something great has happened and you've done even just a little hop, skip and a jump. I remember visiting the little place in the French forest called Compiègne and seeing the railway coach in the clearing in which the Germans signed the armistice in the First World War. And in the railway coach there was a photograph taken many years after the armistice was signed of Hitler on the same spot when the French signed their surrender to him again. And he was so happy to feel that the tarnished name of his nation had gone that in fact those of you old enough to remember will remember that he did a dance by himself, a jig around the railway coach. Not a very dignified thing to do, but he just could not help it. And you have had moments like that when something has happened and you've just expressed it in your body. As a little child you may go, ooh, you know. Now that was simply a dance, expressing what was inside, outside. But that is not the only sort of traffic. It's not just a one-way traffic, what you feel inside, expressing outside. It acts in the reverse way. What you do with your body will affect your inside. And so it's a constant two-way traffic, everything you do with your body. For example, the man who whistles when he's afraid, he's deliberately doing something with his body, you know. And if he goes on doing that with his body, he will in fact have a reverse effect on the inside. And it will help his carriage. Or the old saying that I've seen in dentist waiting rooms, if your face wants to smile, let it, if it won't, make it. You know? Well, there is a sense in which a photographer taking a wedding photograph, now let's have a nice smile, you know, and everybody says cheese and grins, but in fact they will be happier after they've done that than they were before, and you'll find them more relaxed afterwards. Do you see? In other words, between our spirits and our bodies there is a two-way influence, and it can go both ways. In our spiritual life, for example, if we are spiritually fit, then on the whole our bodies will be fitter. It will show itself in more physical health. But it can also act the other way. If your liver's out of order, your prayer life will be that much more difficult. So it goes both ways. And we often think it's always one way, you know. People who may simply be physically under power and have picked up a germ may be saying, you know, I'm spiritually down, I must get right with the Lord, and then I won't be feeling so bad. And it may be just the other way on. It can go both ways, and it's important to discern whether the spiritual is the cause or effect, or whether the physical is the cause or effect in each case. You see, what I'm building up is this, that what you do with your body will not only express what's inside, but will also stimulate what's inside. It'll do both. And there is a good reason there are two good reasons, therefore, for doing something. Either that it expresses what's already inside, or helps to put inside what should be there. And that's why we're commanded to praise God. There may be some times when you don't feel like praising God, and it's not in there to come out, but it will be very good for you to do so. Because as you do it, then you will stimulate praise inside. And so it's a two-way effect. Have I said enough to make the point? And therefore the two questions that you ask about anything that you're doing with the body is, what is this expressing and what is it stimulating? and that will give you a guideline. You can ask that about eating food. You can ask it about drinking wine. You can ask it about a dozen activities of your body. What is this expressing that's in me, or what is it stimulating within me? It might be either or both. Now, the particular thing we're asking about in the activity of the body is dancing. And there are three areas in which dance has been used, or can be used, both to express and to stimulate. The divine area, which makes dancing a moral activity. The satanic, which makes dancing an immoral activity. And the human, which makes dancing an amoral activity, which means neither good nor bad, but simply an expression. We talk about the first as religious dancing, in which you are seeking to express praise, penitence, prayer, but something towards God, and which in turn will stimulate that. That's a moral area, if you like. Then there is aesthetic dancing, which is purely human and is done for the appeal of grace, speed and rhythm, which is simply done for the human sake of being beauty within itself. I'm afraid I've never been greatly myself taken with ballet, but I guess you would put quite a bit of ballet in that area. Simply for the rhythm, grace of movement, which has its own aesthetic appeal, and which is a human area. It may be thoroughly neutral morally, neither good nor bad. People may watch it and come out neither harmed nor helped in the moral realm, but having been relaxed aesthetically, or stimulated aesthetically. Then there are the satanic areas of dance, which concentrate on aggression. Some of those war dances I mentioned earlier, have you seen them? I'm sure you've seen war dances. I'm not going to imitate them. But you know the kind of thing that really are working up that which is wrong. Now, very often before people go into battle in Africa, they have a war dance to get all the adrenaline flowing, to get all the hate worked up, to get all the wrong attitudes stimulated, not just expressed, but to get them stimulated. And you can see how a dance can in fact work somebody up to a frenzy, to the point where that which they've stimulated takes over, and they then express it in attacking someone else. There are many other wrong emotions in the flesh, lust, pride, that dance can stimulate to the point where it takes over the person. And where you're not expressing something, you're seeking to stimulate it and to work it up until you have become a victim of it. Therefore, there is need, when you look at dancing, to ask which of these three groups it's in. Is it the divine? Is it the human? Is it the satanic? What is it expressing? What is it stimulating? Now, all that's by way of introduction. So let me now go to the Old Testament. Let's take then the Old Testament first. Now, not a lot is said about dancing in the Bible. We'll say that straight away, but there is plenty. And it is always presented as a normal feature of life. That's the first thing I want to say. It's accepted as a normal part of life. It's neither commended nor condemned in that sense. It's simply accepted as part of human behavior, especially in groups and in society. Therefore, Ecclesiastes 3:4 is simply stating the obvious when it says of human experience, there's a time to fight, a time to refrain from fighting, or a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to weep and a time to be glad and a time to dance. In other words, it's a normal feature of the whole of human life. It's not always the appropriate thing to do. And there's clearly a time not to dance. But it's a normal part of life. One thinks of the tragic story in Judges 11, where Jephthah vowed to God after he defeated the Ammonites, "Oh God, when I get home, the first living thing that I see, I'll sacrifice to you." And it says that when he got home, his little daughter, or his daughter, was so glad to see him, she came running out and danced before him, out of joy at seeing Daddy home. And I'm afraid one could say that was a time not to dance. She should have kept indoors. But she was just expressing the joy of seeing Daddy come home in dance. And I guess your children may have done the same thing. So that first thing, it's presented as a normal feature of life. Something that is part of human experience. Having said that, there are 4 groups of dancing, or 4 categories of dancing, in the Old Testament. The first I want to mention is dancing to celebrate victory. I can remember vividly an evening in Jerusalem when some of us were in the King David Hotel just at the end of the 6-day war, and in the hotel ballroom we managed to squeeze in with about 500 or 600 Israelis. There must have been 40 or 50 soldiers who'd lost arms and legs in the 6-day war sitting there. And David Ben-Gurion was there, Moshe Dayan was there, and they were dancing to celebrate the victory. I've never seen such dancing in my life. Even these poor wounded soldiers without arms and legs were flinging what limbs they had left around. And it was, wasn't it? It was such a dance to express victory. And there was this tremendous sense of expressing the joy. It wasn't stimulating, it was more expressing that night. Now, you felt when you saw it that night that this was just so part of the Old Testament life. Can any of you think of occasions when it was done? The most obvious is Exodus 15, Miriam. I want you to notice there, by the way, that it was the women who danced, not the men. It's just interest, but we're going to see that come up again. But the women, led by a leader, playing timbrels, they danced for victory, for sheer joy. And that's the first occasion we read of in the Bible of such victory. Do you remember another famous occasion? You've heard of Goliath. Have you ever read what happened when the news spread through Israel that Goliath was dead? The women again, not the men, but the women, immediately put it into a dance. And the women danced again with musical instruments and percussion, band, and so on. It's interesting too, by the way, that's 1 Samuel 18:6, if you want to jot these references down. Exodus 15:20, 1 Samuel 18:6. And 1 Samuel 30, verse 16, tells us that the Amalekites did the same thing. So that it wasn't just Israel. This was a normal part of life. It wasn't something specifically of the people of God, but they did it as other people did it. That was the way to celebrate. How many of you were in London on VE Day? Well, did you see any dancing that night? Of course you did. You saw dancing all around the streets. It was the normal expression of victory. Now, the second group of dances that I want to point to are definitely religious, often connected with festivals or special occasions. And remember now we're talking about Israel. The first is in Judges chapter 21, verse 19, where the first headquarters of religious worship was at a place called Shiloh, long before Jerusalem. Shiloh was the first place where the Ark of God was kept. And we find from that chapter that again the women, the girls of the community of Shiloh, would come and do dances together around the Ark of the Lord. The rest of the story we perhaps needn't go into in detail. The men who hid around and watched and took wives from the girls that came out to dance. But the fact that they knew where to go and get them shows that this was a regular occurrence at Shiloh. But I suppose the most well-known occasion was where a man did this, and that was the greatest king of all Israel, the man after God's own heart, King David. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 14 to 16 particularly. David alone did a solo dance before the ark when he realized that they were going to get it up to Jerusalem after all. and he danced when they'd gone 6 yards from the house where it had been kept for 3 months, and he danced all the way up to Jerusalem, which would be a matter of what? 5 miles? 10 miles? It was some dance anyway. Now, the questions that I've been asked and have been raised with me, which I want to tackle, are, was David right in doing this? Or was there something in his wife's reaction that pointed to the fact that he was, in fact, sinning? David said, I was dancing before the Lord. It was to him I did it. His wife had very different ideas. Michal was disgusted with him at making an exhibition of himself. He really got into hot water when he got home. His wife had a go at him. He'd had a great day till then. And then his wife said, what do you think you were doing today? It's a very human situation. She felt he'd been thoroughly undignified. He had in fact not been dressed as a king. He had worn a linen ephod. That could mean one of two things. It was certainly a priestly dress, and the basic priest's ephod was simply a loincloth. Swimming trunks, if you like. The high priest's linen ephod was a garment that stretched from the shoulders to the thighs, much longer garment. But I think it's probably likely that he was wearing simply the loincloth. It was perfectly decent to dress like that, but it was the dress of a poor man. It was the dress of someone who couldn't afford anything else to put on. And you'll see plenty of Indians, I did in Hyderabad, simply dressed like that. And her point was, you just degraded yourself. The king dressed like a commoner. Now, because she was so disgusted with him, she used very extravagant language about him. And she said, you were exposing yourself to all the girls in the street as if you were a common pervert. That's pretty strong language. And we've got to ask, was she right or was she wrong? I'm going to say that the more I look at this passage, the more I'm convinced that Michal was wrong. And that the evil was in her mind and not in the dancing. And that in fact she was reading into this something that only her mind could have thought of. In fact, David's made it quite clear that he was quite sure that the girls who had been on the streets would not share her thoughts at all. And the reasons why I believe this are these. First of all, David did say it was before the Lord. Second, David did point out that Michal was the daughter of Saul, whom God had deposed in favor of himself. And he's virtually saying, who do you think is more likely to be right? You, the daughter of your father, or the man whom God chose to replace him as the man who should lead the people Israel? He's almost saying there's a bit of your father coming out in this. It was he who had the mind that saw evil where it didn't exist. The third thing is that David says, I'm willing to be a fool and to look a fool, to show my joy in the Lord. That's something many of us are not prepared to do. And I think it may be a reason for some of our hesitation sometimes, that we are not willing to look a fool for the Lord's sake. We feel that showing our joy, like a child who's so happy he's got to dance, is looking foolish in the eyes of other people. But David is saying, I don't mind looking foolish to people as long as I look right to God. That's an important principle. But the fourth thing is that David said, those girls in the street respect me. It's only my own wife who doesn't. And the fifth thing that clinches it for me is this, because all this could simply be what David said. The fifth thing is that Michal was punished by God for what she said. Because only God could bring the punishment that came to Michal for what she did. She was childless for the rest of her life. And throughout the Bible, that is an act of God, not an act of man. And it was Michal who was punished. On the negative side, there is no hint in this story whatever that David was rebuked by the Lord. He did sin, he did do wrong things, but when he did, God always made sure that he knew. and sent Nathan or somebody else to say, David, you've stepped over the mark this time. And there is no trace anywhere in this. On the contrary, if you read subsequent events, the blessing of the Lord attended this king. So that having looked fairly carefully at this passage, it seems to me clear that David did a good thing this day, that the Lord honored it, and that the one who saw evil in something good was punished by the Lord for doing so. I think this is important, because it's the kind of passage that can be used in different ways. It is therefore not surprising to me that after this event, indeed some time after this event, David exhorts the children of Israel to use dance themselves in worship. Psalm 149 verse 3, Psalm 150 verse 4. If he had had any conscience at all about himself dancing before the ark, if he'd felt any afterthoughts at all that this was wrong and unacceptable to God, the one thing he would not have done would be to instruct the people whom God had appointed him to lead to do such a thing. And so in the last two Psalms in the book, which in a sense are a climax to the book of Psalms, it's absolutely clear it's addressed to men. Indeed, the phrase sons of Zion really means men and women. But it's certainly men, and he says, sons of Zion, praise the Lord with dance in the assembly of the faithful. Nothing could be clearer than that in the Old Testament, using dance in worship was a legitimate expression and stimulation of praise, and that just as musical instruments were used for the same purpose, so could dance. Usually the dancing was accompanied by timbrels, which would be the nearest thing to our tambourines, which provide a real percussive sound and rhythm sound for bodily movement. And so timbrels are often associated. Miriam used them, and clearly in Psalm 150 they're used as well. The third form is what I would call the bad form of dancing, showing again that dancing can be used for good or for evil. I think one of the mistakes that Christians have made for a long time is to have a list, a kind of boxes of these things are always evil, these things are always good. But you know, sometimes you can put the same thing in both boxes, and things can be morally neutral. For example, those who say money is the root of all evil are misquoting the Bible. Money can do a great deal of good. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. Money is neither good nor bad. When it's worshipped and becomes your God, it becomes mammon and has become an evil thing. Dancing does become an evil thing because it is associated with idolatry and immorality, the golden calf which Aaron made for the children of Israel. And when Moses came down, he saw them eating and drinking and dancing in front of Aaron's calf. Now, if that situation makes dancing wrong in itself, then that situation also makes eating wrong in itself and drinking wrong in itself. But of course, none of these three things are wrong in themselves. All three were wrong in that situation because all three were associated with idolatry and immorality. And there have been various dances based on that scene since. I noticed that in London, how long ago? A year ago? There was an opera. Can anybody tell me? You didn't notice it? Then I will draw it to your attention. Based on this very act of Aaron's calf. I think that was the title. And the very thing on the stage of London was as wrong as this was originally. It was based on it. And it was expressing and stimulating the wrong thing. The fourth category that I want to mention is prophetic. The prophetic references to dancing. I know they're already covered in a sense, but let me look at two of them. In the book of Lamentations, chapter 5, verse 15, Jeremiah, lamenting Jerusalem, mourning over Jerusalem, says, "The young no longer dance or sing." Notice the young do it here. "Our dance has turned to mourning." M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. Now that was the lamentation. But Jeremiah, in his prophecy, chapter 31 says this: "Listen to this message from the Lord, you nations of the world, and publish it abroad. The Lord who scattered his people will gather them back together again and watch over them as a shepherd does his flock. He will save Israel from those who are too strong for him. They shall come home and sing songs of joy upon the hills of Zion, and shall be radiant over the goodness of the Lord, the good crops, the wheat and the wine and the oil, and the healthy flocks and herds. Their life shall be like a watered garden, and all their sorrow shall be gone. The young girls will dance for joy, and men folk, old and young, will take their part in all the fun. For I will turn their mourning into joy." Now that's the reversal promised. But the interesting thing about that reversal promised, their dancing had been turned to mourning. Jeremiah predicts a day when all the Israelites will be gathered back again in their own country. And he immediately goes on in the same chapter, "The day will come when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel," and speaks of the new covenant which Jesus established. Now it's interesting that in that one chapter, the new covenant is associated with joy and dancing. Now I know it's for Israel, but even if it's only for Israel, you've got here the link between the new covenant which God is making with ancient Israel and the joy and the dancing that will follow the restoration of this nation. And I believe that this will literally come true, that when Israel turns to her Messiah and to her Lord and enters into the new covenant, you will see young people dancing all over Israel, and the young and the old men will join in the fun. Now I can see that happening, having been in Israel for that 25th anniversary, and some of you were there too, and seen the dancing there was just over an earthly celebration. What will it be like when Israel looks on him whom they pierced? And in the name of Christ, then, they will dance. I have no doubt about this whatever. It's a prediction of Jeremiah. That is not to say it's right yet for Gentile Christians, but what I'm saying that for Jewish Christians, the Bible would seem to support them dancing in the name of Christ to express their joy. Well, now, so much for the Old Testament. Let me now turn to the New Testament. The first thing that hits us is that dancing was a normal part of New Testament social life, both of adult life and children's life. And that when Jesus refers to it, he refers to it as a normal part of life. He never refers to it in a critical frame or in a condemnatory way. He always simply refers to it in the same tone of breath, you might say, or tone of voice, at which he refers to eating and drinking, or sowing seed, or anything else. It's a normal part of life. That comes out in two things. Luke chapter 7, which I quoted on Sunday night, where he describes children playing in the marketplace and learning how to do weddings and funerals and how to dance and how to mourn. Now, he doesn't stop and say, of course, poor little things, how misled they are. They're being brought up to dance, and it's dreadful to see children learning such things. No, he simply refers to it. Children playing in the marketplace, doing this. But when he refers to adults doing it, again, it's a normal expression of joy. When the prodigal came home, there were sounds of music and dancing. And the word translated dancing in English is our word chorus. Chorus, and refers to organized dancing. I wonder if any of you have seen the film Fiddler on the Roof. Now, you saw the men dancing in that, you know. Sort of well, that is very near to the style of dancing that probably is being referred to here. Chorus dancing means people dancing in harmony, in order with each other. And our Lord mentions this as perfectly normal. Now, the interesting thing is that he could have said that when the prodigal came home, that was the end of all dancing for him. He danced enough in the far country. And I'm quite sure he'd had enough of number 3 in the far country. But the interesting thing is that Jesus just quite normally says, and they began to celebrate. And there was music and dancing. As if, you know, this is the way to do it. No criticism, no condemnation, just here's a simple expression of sheer joy. the elder brother does seem to have had a bit of a streak of Michal in him. What's going on? Why was I not told? He heard the sound of music and dancing and was very angry. Something going on here. This isn't our respectable homestead. You can almost feel it, can't you? But maybe I'm reading a bit much into it. There is one sad instance of evil dancing in the New Testament showing that it can still be used wrongly. Salome. And in that incident you've got a number of features of the effects of the wrong kind of dancing. A man loses his self-control. A man is swept into a situation he never intended to get into. A man makes foolish promises. A man finds himself ultimately with shame and regret. And it's the result of the wrong kind of dancing. So you've got both in the New Testament. You've got the right expression for the right reasons and the right motives. You've got the wrong expression, which inevitably leads to complications of the sort I've mentioned. His passions overrode his principles, and that was the result of it. Now, in the rest of the New Testament, there is a silence on dancing. It's not mentioned again, as far as I know, if you can think of one. It's certainly never mentioned in any of the quite detailed lists of wrong things and practices that Paul uses from time to time. Neither is it mentioned in any of the lists of right things. So that we are confronted in the rest of the New Testament with this funny thing called silence. Now, silence can mean approval or disapproval. That's one of its difficulties. When people are silent at a church meeting, we don't know if that means they're approving or disapproving. And we've become used to this term, the silent majority now. And people claim to know what the silent majority are thinking and claim that they're on their side. And that's one of the dangers of claiming the silences of Scripture to go with you. And if God is silent in the rest of the New Testament on this, it can mean he approves or it can mean he disapproves. What we've seen so far is that there's no indication in Old or New Testament that for God all dancing is bad, nor is there any indication that it's all good. All the indications so far up to this silence are that it's a neutral thing that can be used for good or bad. But can we take this silence a little further? I want you to notice that the silence is not only about dancing, it's also about instrumental music. And there is no mention in the rest of the New Testament which we're considering of instrumental music. Some Christians have taken that to mean that God disapproves of the use of any accompaniment to singing. There is a group of Christians meeting in Stoughton every Sunday that is convinced the silence of the New Testament means no piano, no harmonium, no nothing. And so you'll hear them if you walk up a particular road. I'll tell you which it is afterwards if you want to know. You'll hear them singing in unison, not even in harmony, but in unison, without any musical instruments. And they honestly believe that they are judging the silence of the New Testament aright. On the other hand, there are those who feel that silence should not be taken to mean disapproval, where all the indications up to that silence are neutral. You can't argue that the silence means approval either. But if the Bible up to a certain point is taking one line and then there is silence, you don't assume that God has suddenly changed his mind or gone back on it. And that's why most Christians today have little hesitation about praising God upon instrumental music or accompanying praise with a piano or an organ or a harmonium. Just pointing out the parallel situation. And there's something even more, I think, that can be taken just to, as it were, slightly sway the silence. I'm not trying to make out a positive case. I'm just saying that in the silence, I think the evidence is slightly in favor of the silence being approval rather than disapproval, for this last reason, that the early Christians continued in the temple worship. That's rather important. They continued using the Psalms and the set prayers of Judaism. And until the Gentiles came in, the Jewish Christians continued daily in the temple. And therefore the worship of the temple was early Christian worship. So that they obviously didn't feel they must now cut themselves off from that worship now that they had become Christians. They took it into their system, as it were. Now all that is simply saying that I think the evidence is still neutral, and that the silence of Scripture means it can be used for good and it can be used for harm. As a matter of historical interest, I looked up the history on this, and the earliest Christian churches, even among the Gentiles, allowed dancing when it was healthy and wholesome, as a legitimate human activity and as a legitimate expression of praise. But when it degenerated, as it did, churches increasingly began to ban it and to stop it. Now, under what circumstances can we say that dancing could be acceptable within Christian fellowship in the light of all we've learned of the Bible? Let's go back to the three areas that we mentioned. What I call the divine or religious use, the human, simply the aesthetic, speed, grace and rhythm, and the satanic, in which dancing is deliberately used to release things in the flesh that ought not to be released. And the modern idea that we ought to live for self-expression and that everything in the self is worth expressing is totally contrary to the Bible. There are things that are in all of us that ought not to be expressed and ought not to be stimulated and be brought out. Well, now it seems to me from what we've said so far that there should be little doubt that the first is an acceptable offering of praise to God in worship, and that it should be seen to be that, and that it should be before the Lord, and that it should be offered to the Lord from a pure heart and for His praise alone. And personally, I find it impossible to find anything in the Bible to deny that one. When we come to the second area, we are, I think, getting into an area where questions need to be asked. For example, there was a barn dance the other evening, and so far as I was concerned, and so far as I could see, it was a most wholesome and healthy evening, and great fun and expressing human friendship in a very happy way and delightful surroundings. I think one of the reasons for that was that it was group dancing. And I think that is one of the factors that tends to keep it healthy. I think the question is bigger when it becomes simply couple dancing. And I've noticed that usually it's when dancing moves from group to couple dancing that the difficulties begin to creep in. I'm only just speaking now from observation and a bit of experience. I think that's the point at which the question mark comes in, where it's one big group dancing together and not couples smooching in the darkness. Then it's, I think, quite a different kind of thing, quite different. Then the third sort, I think, is pretty clear to everybody, and we don't need to go into it. That is clearly out as far as Christians are concerned. So it is the middle area that presents the greatest difficulty. And this is why many churches have taken the line that rather than constantly face the difficulty, they just don't have that kind of dancing in church. Whereas, on the other hand, there are those who say, if it is healthy human expression, then the evil is in the mind of the beholder and not in the people who are dancing. And so it is that middle area that is the debatable one, and the one that Christians have most strong feelings about usually. Because there's very big gulf usually between the use of dance in worship and the kind of ballroom dancing or discotheque or what have you at the other end, as it were. Now, we've got to bear in mind also that there are Christians who have been converted from 3, and that for them even 2 could be a problem. You with me so far? And that if there are in your company those for whom doing two would not only be a reminder but be a source of temptation to three, that you have to take their conscience into account. One of the foundation principles of the New Testament is this, that we must never cause a weaker brother to sin, to go against his own conscience. And therefore, if I do something that leads someone else to sin before the Lord, then I've done wrong. Far better for me to live a narrower life and do without this than make my brother to stumble. Now I want finally to say something very important about this, about the weaker brother's conscience. I want you to notice that it is the weaker brother who has the conscience. That's a very important point. We tend to think that it's the stronger brother who will have the biggest conscience. But in fact it isn't. A weaker conscience in the Bible... Sorry? Yeah.
Does a stronger brother or a strong Christian, may he not ever have conscience?
Oh yes, but in the sense of a weaker conscience, we mean a conscience with more scruples. I think that's an important point I want to make. That in fact, as a Christian matures, it becomes safer for him to be in some situations or in certain activities. And that in fact when we first become a Christian, it's safer for us to keep out of anything that could be a source of trouble to us, a reminder of the old life. But as we mature and grow stronger and nearer to the Lord, it becomes possible for us to go back into an old situation and remain true to the Lord in it and evangelize in it. Have you got the picture? And so as you become a stronger brother, your conscience allows you to do more, and you begin to understand the truth that God has given us all things freely to enjoy. But when you were an unconverted person, you abused those things. Do you see? And so you became a Christian, and God gave you a conscience with a scruple about that thing to keep away from it. But as you grow stronger in the Lord, you can cope with it. Are you all following me? Now the point I want to make is very important. We are not talking now about offending someone's convictions or taste, but offending their conscience. And you only offend a conscience if you lead that person to sin and guilt before God, so that they feel they must go and ask forgiveness for having been part of the situation. It is not offending someone who believes that a thing is wrong. Now I wonder how I can say this. You see, let's take an immediate life situation. We have a group who express praise in dance in the church. Now I've no doubt whatever that will not be to everyone's taste. I've no doubt whatever that it will not be to everyone's conviction. Some will feel that's right and some will feel it's wrong. But I have not, having heard a number of people tell me what their taste and conviction was, I've not met one person in this church who in fact, because of what Shekinah did before us, sinned before the Lord and said, I had to go home and ask his forgiveness. Now, even though it was against their taste or conviction, their conscience had not been offended. Now, have you followed that? It's a very important point. On the other hand, if one hears that somebody, as the result of what we did, actually sinned before the Lord, then you would be right into this situation of having caused a weaker brother to stumble. And if someone said, I had to go home and get on my knees and say, God forgive me, then we'd have done it. Can you see this? And often things are done in the name of conscience, which are not. They're in the name of conviction. And so a thing may really have been against someone's conviction, but they do not feel guilty about it. They don't feel they're in a position of sin. Can you see that? And where we have differing convictions, we ought to respect and recognize those differing convictions. But if you always went on the principle that you don't do a thing that's against anyone's convictions, Frankly, the church would never do anything. You really would be in problems. But where it is against someone's conscience, and as a result they have sinned in their own eyes in taking part in that thing, then you really have to take notice. And you must change your behavior, even if it's in a direction that is narrower than your own conscience would allow you. That's the basic principle, I think, that needs to be applied in this situation. I hope I've explained it clearly. It's causing a weaker brother to stumble, not to disagree, but to stumble, actually to sin. And that's a very important difference. I think I could illustrate that by the visit of the King Edward girls here on Sunday evening. They came, bless them, in David's loincloth, but they came in their leotards, which for them was perfectly normal dress for free movement. But that in fact was a cause of stumbling to some. I don't mean it was against their convictions. I mean it did hurt their conscience and made them guilty. So that we shall have that group back again, I do hope. They want to come back and share more of their worship, but I shall ask them to wear different costume next time. Do you see? Now that's taking note of conscience. But as far as I know, when Sheikh and I were here, and you can tell me afterwards if I'm wrong, I haven't met anybody who has sinned as a result of their coming to lead us in worship. It's certainly been against some people's opinion and against their taste, but it's not been against their conscience. Well, now that's dancing as far as I can see it. The one place it will be safe to dance will be in heaven. And personally, my understanding of the Bible and my experience of life leads me to feel that rightly done, and done in the love and power of the Spirit and the good taste of the Spirit, that dancing can be a little foretaste of heaven, of praise and expression of glory to God.